Good morning or afternoon, everyone. We have a few minutes before the start of the hour here, and lots of people are trying to dial in. So I'm going to give it a few more minutes before we get started. Probably 2 or 3 minutes past the hour is when we'll get started. I have everybody in listen-only mode right now, so if there's any questions or concerns, please use the chat box to communicate. Otherwise, we'll get started in probably about 5 or 6 minutes. Again, good afternoon, everyone. Several more people have joined in the last several minutes. I have straight up 12 noon Central right now, but I'm going to give it a few more minutes as people are dialing in here before we get started. If there's any, I have everybody in listen-only mode right now, so if there are any questions or immediate concerns, please communicate through the chat box. We'll start in about 3 minutes. All right, welcome everyone. It's 3 minutes past our hour, and I'm going to get the webinar started. This is Eric Lanke of the National Fluid Power Association, and I want to welcome everybody to the webinar where we are going to be reviewing the process that we will follow over the next several months to review and update the NFPA Technology Roadmap. You're likely dialed into this webinar because you are a member of the NFPA Roadmap Committee, or we have asked you to participate in our process because of your position in the industry or some other special expertise that you have that we think would be beneficial to the discussions going forward. And in both cases, I want to make sure that I thank everybody for their engagement and participation in this process. I am recording our presentation today so that you can re-review it if necessary, or we can share it with other folks who were not able to dial in right now. As I mentioned before, I have everybody in listen-only mode right now, so I'm the only voice that can be heard. So if there are any questions or that come up during the presentation, I would ask you to type those into the question box, which should be on your webinar control panel. I have about 18 slides of information to go through and to present, and feel free to enter those questions as we go along, but I won't be able to respond to them until we get to the end, and then I will open up the question box and review what information is in there. If there's some immediate concern, like you can't hear my voice or the slides don't seem to be advancing, please use the chat window to let me know that you're having those difficulties. So with that, let's get the information flowing here. And I'm going to start with clearly defining, hopefully clearly defining what we mean by the NFPA Technology Roadmap. As you can see on the slide on the screen, the Technology Roadmap is a document that we use to describe an industry-wide consensus regarding the pre-competitive research and development needs that are associated with improving the design, manufacture, and function of fluid power components and systems. The research and development agenda that the roadmap describes is intentionally focused on those advancements that we believe will help the fluid power industry meet the future needs of its customers, expand into new markets, and attract the best and brightest students to our field. Our roadmap is used by the NFPA, but also by the Center for Compact and Efficient Fluid Power to help guide their research endeavors. It is also used by many NFPA members and their industry partners to help inform their decisions about research partnerships that they may want to enter into or product development schedules that they're working on. And we know that the roadmap is also used by our many academic, government, and other organizational partners who are interested in pursuing research and development projects of importance to the fluid power industry. We update our roadmap every 2 years under the guidance and leadership of our roadmap committee. And here is a very busy slide, but it is the current roster of the NFPA Roadmap Committee. You can see that it is an extremely large committee. It's the largest committee that NFPA has, which is actually very good for our purposes, as it is designed to comprise a broad cross-section of fluid power manufacturers, fluid power distributors, fluid power suppliers, machine builders, as well as, again, some of our academic and other organizational partners. You can see Mark Volcorny of Sun Hydraulics is our current chair of the committee, and Mike Betts of Danfoss is the vice chair. And they are helping to organize and oversee the update process that we're going to be moving forward with of this year. Now, with a group this large, it's often difficult to keep this roster 100% up to date. So I would ask you to review the information that's here. If you see a listing that's out of date for your company, If the wrong person is listed, or if there are other people that you would like to get involved, please let me know so that we can bring the right people into the conversation. There's no limit on the number of participants from a company that can participate on the committee. Anybody who has interest and relevant knowledge for the conversation would be welcome. It's also important near the start of our process to remind everyone that this activity, like all NFPA activities, need to be conducted in strict accordance with our antitrust guidelines. Because of federal antitrust laws, there are certain topics that are not proper subjects for our discussion. In many cases, including our roadmap committee, the committee members themselves are competitors, and therefore any action or agreement which may eliminate, restrict, or govern competition among them could be construed as a violation of antitrust laws. And those found in violation of those laws are subject to severe criminal and civil penalties. So therefore, as we work together on the roadmap this year, a reminder that we should be sure not to fall into a discussion about anything within the realm of competitive practices. There's a list, I think, in the second paragraph there of some examples: terms of service, future prices, productivity rates, allocation of markets, et cetera, et cetera. We ask that you please adhere strictly to these guidelines to protect both NFPA, but also your company and yourself from any potential liability. I also want to define at the outset this term pre-competitive research and what we mean by pre-competitive as we go through this process. I said a few minutes ago that our technology roadmap describes a industry-wide consensus regarding the pre-competitive research and development needs associated with improving the design, manufacture, and function of fluid power components and systems. And by pre-competitive, we essentially mean research that is being performed at a time in the technology development cycle when interested but potentially competitive parties agree that there is value to be gained from a collaborative rather than a competitive approach. In other words, all parties in the conversation should agree that the research areas and targets that we ultimately define, if successful, will serve everyone's interests, the interests of the whole industry, and not the interests of just a few. That means that pre-competitive research can generally be thought of as residing in the middle ground between absolute fundamental basic research that's conducted mainly in universities, between that and the proprietary research that is primarily performed or directed by companies for product enhancement. As we work together on this year's update to the technology roadmap, we're going to want to stay focused on advancements that we believe can be translated into future improvements, not on specific product improvements that we'd like to see happening today. Okay, there we go. Okay, so one of the unique features for this year's update process, I believe, if memory serves, this is the fourth update that we've performed to our roadmap since we first wrote it probably 8 or so years ago. One of the unique features with this year's process is the fact that there are actually 2 different roadmaps that have been developed or refreshed in the past 2 years. The NFPA Technology Roadmap, a snapshot of which is on the left, has been focused on improving the design and function of fluid power products, and that is one of the 2 roadmaps. The other is the Manufacturing Roadmap, a snapshot of which is on the right. That focuses or has focused on improving the ways in which fluid power products are manufactured. And that document was published by the Fluid Power Advanced Manufacturing Consortium in May of 2017. NFPA, if you will, is the inheritor of both of these documents, and our intention with our process this year is to combine these two roadmaps into kind of one comprehensive roadmap that addresses both the design and functional characteristics, but also the manufacturing processes that are used to produce fluid power products. And I reflected that intent earlier when I defined our roadmap as a document that would focus on those three elements: the design, manufacture, and function of fluid power components and systems. Now, this successful combination is going to frankly require some creativity on our part, as the two documents have some structural differences between them. This is a snapshot of the 2017 NFPA Technology Roadmap. I would encourage you not to get lost in the details here, but to simply look at the basic structure of that document. On the left-hand side, you can see a list of customer drivers that define the needs of the customers that the fluid power industry serves. In the center, you can see a list of the research challenges that the roadmap defined, challenges that fluid power must surmount in order to better meet the needs defined by our customers. And then on the far right, you can see a list of research targets and objectives, a cluster for each of the research challenges that are meant to quantify or describe successful strategies for pursuing the research challenges identified in the roadmap. So to provide a simple example of how that structure manifests itself on the technology roadmap, we can see here in a simplified form, fluid power customers, for example, want their machines to deliver increased productivity and performance to their customers. That's identified as a customer driver. One way that fluid power can help make that happen is by increasing the energy efficiency of fluid power systems. So that becomes a research challenge that is linked to that customer driver. And one potential area for exploration in achieving the research challenge is to focus on reducing the power loss experienced by fluid power components. That becomes a research target in the roadmap structure. By contrast, let's take a look at the structure for the 2017 manufacturing roadmap, which, as you can see, is a little bit different in how some similar concepts have been organized. Again, don't get lost in too many of the details here, but just look at the overall structure of the document. Again, starting over on the far left, you can see a list of what is called customer competitiveness drivers. Those are still drivers that are defining the needs of the customer base, but they are mapped not to research challenges, but to items associated with fluid power's manufacturing capabilities. Those manufacturing capabilities are then in turn mapped to a group of enabling manufacturing technologies. These are technologies that, if better applied in the fluid power manufacturing environment, could help the industry overcome its capability challenges and therefore better meet the competitiveness drivers. And then for each of the enabling manufacturing technologies, there's a prioritized list of research needs. These are areas of need that should be pursued if we are going to successfully apply the enabling technology to the manufacturing challenge in order to better meet the capability driver or the competitiveness driver. And to help put that in a little bit clearer context, perhaps, here's a simple example from the manufacturing roadmap. Again, starting on the left-hand side of this flow chart, we start with the need of the customer. They want their machines to go to market more quickly. That's a competitiveness driver for them. One way that fluid power can help make that happen on the manufacturing front is to reduce its lead time associated with the delivery of fluid power products. So that's a manufacturing capability challenge. One enabling technology that could be applied to that objective is performing the necessary heat treating, not in batches at the end of the manufacturing process, but while the component is in the production line. So batch-free heat treating is therefore one of those enabling manufacturing technologies. And if we're going to leverage that for fluid power, one of the research needs would be figuring out ways to integrate the heat treating into the machining center or work center itself as part of that process. So that's the research need. So hopefully you can see with that short and very hastily prepared overview that we have two different documents that have many similarities but are slightly different from one another. Excuse me. And if we're going to combine these two documents into one as part of our process this year, we're going to need a common set of roadmap elements with a common set of definitions in order to map things appropriately into the same document. And here are those elements. So we've already identified what we believe will be the structure of the 2019 roadmap, which basically takes the best ideas from the two source roadmaps that we'll be working with. And we have created this following structure for us to use as we move forward with our revision process this year. Again, I would direct your attention to the left. We'll start on the left-hand side of the screen. Again, we begin with the customer drivers. Those are defined as the business or technology objectives of the customer of fluid power products, the things that they need to do to better serve the needs of their own customers. And we identify those really without regard to fluid power. They're independent of their use of fluid power. They're the things that the customers themselves want their products to do more effectively. In the example that I've shown here, to try to put some context to this, you can see that I've listed increased productivity and performance as one of the customer drivers that we'll likely be focused on. So that's the first element of the roadmap. Linked to that, moving to the right, will be what we call capability improvements. These will be the ways in which fluid power systems must improve if they are to meet or better meet the customer needs described by the customer drivers. So in the example that I've chosen, increase the power density of fluid power systems could be listed as a capability improvement, using the logic that if fluid power systems were more power dense, they would help our customers deliver increased productivity and performance through their machines to their own customers. So in addition to defining a list of customer drivers, we will work together to identify a list of capability improvements. For each of those capability improvements then, moving another step to the right, we will work together to prioritize a list of what we'll call research areas. And these will be the broad areas of pre-competitive investigation that we believe are needed in order to assist bringing about the capability improvement. In the example that I've shown, using additive manufacturing to produce integrated fluid power components could be one of the research areas that nests with increasing the power density of fluid power systems. If additive can produce more integrated components with the same or better performance characteristics, it would increase the power density of our systems. So now we're moving more squarely into kind of that pre-competitive research space. What do we need to do there to improve fluid power's capabilities so that they can better meet the drivers that we identified at the start of the process? Moving another step then to the right on this chart, for each of the research areas, we'll work together to prioritize a list of research targets. These would be, for each research area, an objective that either quantifies or otherwise describes what industry believes would be a successful strategy for pursuing the research area that we've defined. Again, in the example that I've chosen, a research target for using additive manufacturing would be demonstrate high pressure capability of additively manufactured fluid power components. In order to make additive a viable, in order to use additive manufacturing to make viable integrated components, We essentially need to prove that the additive materials that we're using can withstand the pressures associated with working fluid power systems. So that would be a target that we would recommend researchers focus on in order to work within the research area that we've defined. And then finally, the last step in the roadmap, for each of the research targets, we will attempt to track aligned research projects that we know are going on pre-competitively in the field. That is, projects that are specifically addressing or attempting to achieve the research targets. We've not had that in roadmaps before. That's kind of a new element that we'd like to explore this time around. We believe that not all research targets will actually have research projects associated with them, and that may be beneficial in and of itself to demonstrate the effectiveness, if you will, or the level of execution that we see on some of these areas. But by attempting to track those research projects, we hope to gain a better understanding of the state of the art, if you will, in the field, and a sense of the gaps in our industry's pre-competitive research portfolio. To complete the example, you can see that I've invented a research project that someone is doing where they're pressure testing to failure additively manufactured fluid power components to kind of stay in line with the overall example that I've offered. Okay, so that's a lot of information, I know, but hopefully you can see the structure of what we're going to be working on for really the next 6 months as we go through this reinvention process. Now, in order to get there, in order to combine the two roadmaps into the structure that I've just laid out, we need to define a clear and consistent methodology for how we're going to do that. And I've tried to describe that methodology here on this slide. I'm frankly not going to read through all the information that you see here in detail, but I'll summarize it to say what we plan to do is take each element from each of the two roadmaps and align them with the category that makes the most sense, given its position in its respective roadmap. So when we pull something off the technology roadmap, we'll ask, is that a customer driver? Is it a capability improvement? Is it a research area, et cetera, et cetera? And we'll line those things up from both of the two roadmaps in that manner. And then we will eliminate duplicates because there undoubtedly will be some duplication coming off the two documents, and then try to condense that list down into its essential ideas. So that's the methodology that we use to kind of prepare our first draft of what the new roadmap will look like. And with regard to implementing that, I've got both good news and bad news for the committee. The good news is we've already done it. So here is a snapshot of all of that work I just described being completed. And we're calling this a draft of the 2019 NFPA Technology Roadmap. It's been created using the definitions and methodology that I just tried to describe. You can see that it contains 9 customer drivers that are connected to 8 capability improvements, that are connected to 32 research areas, which are connected to 59 research targets and 54 research projects. So that's the good news. The bad news is I'm the one who did this, and I don't always know what I'm doing when it comes to these kinds of decisions. So the work for our roadmap committee going forward over the next several months is going to be checking my work, is going to be looking at this document in its combined form, basically from the ground up, using the protocol that I described earlier, starting with the customer drivers and moving left to right on this chart. Not only reviewing the way in which I combine things together, but knowing that 2 years have progressed since the last time these words were put down on paper, talking about edits or changes or additions that are important to include in the next version of the technology roadmap. So in order to execute that, the last section here of our webinar of the information I'm presenting, let me kind of go through the process and timeline for kind of how we see the committee working together on that process. After our webinar today, we're going to break it up basically into 3 phases. Phase 1 is described here on this first slide, and you can see that our initial focus is going to be squarely on only the customer drivers and the capability improvements. And that's going to take us, February and March will be the rough time frame that we'll be working on those 2 elements. Early in February, we're going to be sending out to the committee what I call a set of briefing materials. That's a little bit of homework reading that we would ask all the committee members to do, but it will help you explore and think about the status of customer drivers in our marketplace, as well as the status of Fluid Power's current capabilities in meeting those drivers. We're going to include supplemental materials like our customer market survey. That shows the relative percentage of Fluid Power products being sold into each of our customer markets. It's also going to include the list of drivers and capability improvements that we've pulled off the 2 2017 roadmaps, as well as the worksheets that I use to combine and collapse them down into that draft list of drivers and improvements for 2019. And as I said, we're going to ask committee members to study that information and then return through a feedback form some of their responses for changes or improvements that should be made on either of those 2 fronts. And we'll take that information and use it to drive the agenda for our first in-person meeting, which will be happening on March 1st at the FPIC, or Fluid Power Industrial Consortium Seminar in Milwaukee on March 1st. At that meeting, using all of that background material that I described, our task will be to identify and rank the final list of customer drivers, identify and rank and connect the final capability improvements to those customers' drivers, and just begin then to discuss possible research areas and targets that the rest of the roadmap should be focused on. So that will be phase 1 of our process. Phase 2 then follows, and we'll turn our attention with the customer drivers and capability improvements finished. We'll then turn our attention to the research areas and research targets. And this work is going to be done April, May, and June of this year. We'll follow a similar but slightly revised process as we did for drivers and improvements. The first thing we're going to do is identify a set of working groups from the larger committee, 1 for each of the capability improvements that we finalize at that March 1st meeting. We've used that structure for the last 2 refreshes of the roadmap, and it works very well. It helps us align committee members with specific knowledge sets in each of the different areas, and it helps spread the work more effectively across a large committee. So we'll set up some working groups for the different capability improvements. We'll send out a set of, again, briefing materials that will help them explore and think about research areas and targets, both from the existing 2 roadmaps, but also other new areas that may have emerged. And then we will schedule a conference call sometime in that probably May timeframe for each of the working groups to come together to discuss and rank the research areas for their area of capability improvement, and also identify and rank a set of research targets for each of those research areas. We'll have, for example, 7 or 8 committees, if you will, working in 7 or 8 different areas. They may wind up with some information that overlaps with one another because they'll be working in isolation, if you will. So we'll then take the output of all of those calls and bring it and use it to drive the agenda for our second in-person meeting, which will be held on June 7th, again at the FPIC seminar scheduled here in Milwaukee, where we will review all the work that the committees have done and work together to remove any redundancies that we see, improve synergies between the different areas if needed, and start to prioritize in the overall the different research areas and targets that have been identified. And that'll be the end of phase 2 of the process. And then we'll finish with phase 3, where we're focusing now on the assembly and approval of the final roadmap document. This is going to take place in July and August of this year. We'll take all of the information that the committee has helped us develop through those meetings and conference calls, and we will draft a final version of the roadmap, which we will circulate to the committee for a high-level review. We'll collect feedback and make revisions based on the feedback that we receive. And then we will present the final draft at our Industry Outlook conference in August. That'll be in suburban Chicago. And assuming that presentation goes off well, and don't need to make any additional changes, we will then publish the roadmap and disperse it to all of our various stakeholders. Okay, so that's 18 slides, like I promised, and that brings me to the end of the formal information. I'll look here at the question box to see if any questions have come in while I was talking. Hold on here. There we go. So far I only have one question, and it's the most popular question we get on webinars. Can we get a copy of this presentation afterwards? Yes, of course. We will be sending out these slides to the full committee, as well as a recording of the entire session. So you'll get that shortly after we wrap up here today. If there are other questions, please type them in to the question box. Another one just came in. Can you provide some additional details about what leads up to the phase 1 and phase 2 meetings? Mark, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking for there. Let me try to unmute you. Can you hear me? Can you go ahead and talk, Mark?
Oh, yeah, great. Yeah, Eric, as far as what leads up to the work we're going to do before the phase 1 and phase 2 meetings, you'd spoken about it sounded like having some kind of survey, questions go out, or something to that effect. I was just curious if you could provide some more details about what that might be.
Yeah, so before the March 1 meeting, again, the focus is going to be on customer drivers and capability improvements. And so I will be sending out a packet of information as I described, and there will be a survey, for lack of a better way of saying it, a way to collect people's ideas and thoughts after they review that information. I've not yet drafted exactly what that's going to be or look like, but its focus will be on giving your knowledge of the marketplace and the customers that you're familiar with. What do you think their needs are? And then based on what those needs are that you've identified, how well do you think Fluid Power currently is at meeting those needs? We did a similar exercise 2 years ago at one of our in-person meetings, and it really helped to kind of define and prioritize those two elements. So it'll be something along those lines. Did that help?
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's helpful, Eric.
Okay. And then at the phase 2 meeting in June, like I said, a lot of that is going to come out of the conference calls. So we'll have these conference calls where the subgroups will be, now that we have the capability improvements in hand, what are the research areas and targets that we believe should be prioritized to the top of that list? And that will really form the agenda for the June 1st meeting to look at it in total and compare and contrast them to make sure we're not duplicating ourselves. Okay, are there any other questions? If so, type them into the box. That worked pretty well, actually, so I think I can unmute people one by one. If you have a question you'd like to ask, just type a quick note into the question box and I can unmute you. I'm not seeing any questions come in, so I must have done a fantastic job describing what can sometimes be a fairly complicated process. I'll give it just another couple of seconds here. Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, then let me reiterate that, again, we have recorded this webinar, and so we will send that recording and the slide deck out to everyone on today's call, as well as everyone on the committee, because we have probably by head count here about 2/3 of the committee online with us right now. And then immediate action items for you, for committee members. If you haven't done so already, please try to protect March 1st and June 7th on your calendars. If you're able to join us in Milwaukee for the in-person meetings, that would be ideal. Also, it's farther out, but we'll be presenting this at the August IEOC conference in August. I think that's August 12th through the 14th, if I remember correctly. So that would be an important set of dates to get on your calendars. And then the next concrete action after that, as I said, probably first week of February, you will receive from me that first briefing packet where it'll contain the information and a protocol for providing feedback into the customer driver and capability improvement process. And we'll go forward from there. So just had another question pop up. It's from what is the motivation to combine design and manufacturing portions? The expertise and technology needs are different and may be difficult to focus when we have both together. Yes, I think that's one of the challenges that we'll face, that there are different brains, if you will, who all live in the design space versus those who live in the manufacturing space. And we will want to try to leverage kind of both of that market intelligence in this process going forward. We do believe that if we're successful in accomplishing that, we will have a more comprehensive and more useful document for both the industry and the academic partners that we work with to go from, because it will help us essentially prioritize and nest. There are many times where a manufacturing advance helps a design element, or a new design element can lead to different manufacturing processes, and having them as two completely separate documents often obscures the synergies that exist in that process. So our motivation in trying to bring those together is to try to eliminate some of that duplication and confusion, although again we admit that it's a little bit more challenging to do it than as two separate conversations. And then the next question just came in. March 1st is coming up quickly. Do you know what times of the day the meeting will be and where? Yes, again, the meeting will be here in Milwaukee as part of our series of FPIC seminars. So we will have a full-fledged Fluid Power Industrial Consortium seminar the morning of March 1st. And then we will transition into the Roadmap Committee meeting, which will start with lunch and end by 2 o'clock that afternoon. So, and that's a good reminder that I should probably send those details out as a calendar appointment to folks to see if they can accept or reject that. So I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, I'm going to call it to a close there then. Again, thank you all for your attention on today's call and for your participation in our process. Technology Roadmap is a very critical program, and it's relied on by a lot of NFPA members and our partners. And I hope you, like me, are looking forward to a robust discussion and a great end product when we come to the end of this process. So again, thank you, and I'll sign off.